All right, so welcome to the second installment of the 2017 Tree Board webinar series. Today's presenter, Ed Macie, has been gracious enough to come talk about tree ordinances and community tree programs. So Ed has recently retired as the Southern Region Urban Forestry Group Leader for the USDA Forest Service in Atlanta, Georgia. He has over 30 years of experience in urban forestry, having served as with the Forest Service as a county arborist and an arboricultural consultant. For the past 25 years, Ed has directed the Southern Region Urban Forestry Program for the Forest Service, where he administered grants and educational programs to help states deliver their urban forestry programs. Community-based groups plant and maintain trees and improve the environment where people live, work, and play. Ed also strongly supports urban forestry research and science delivery, having established the Centers for Urban and Interface Forestry in Athens, Georgia, and Gainesville, Florida. His educational backgrounds include a bachelor's degree in environmental horticultural and arboriculture from UC Davis and a master's in urban forest ecology from State University of New York. So with that, Ed, I will go ahead and you can get started. I will move to the first screen.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. Good afternoon, everybody, and happy almost Earth Day. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with all of you. I want to start by first telling you that I'm a little bit disadvantaged technologically. I work off Apple-based operating systems, which don't work very well with a live meeting. So Leslie's going to be manually advancing the slides for me, so if it seems a little cumbersome, I apologize for that. Next, Leslie. I have planned to present this talk in three layers, focused on a lot of frequent questions that I get regarding urban forest programs and tree boards and tree ordinances. And so I'm going to start first by talking about some of the, next Leslie, the authorities that exist in the state of North Carolina and how those authorities exist and where they come from, because that all sets the foundations for the programs that we have at the local level. From there, I plan to talk about the various components that exist within an urban forest program, and we'll discuss a little bit about which of those components belong in tree ordinances and which can be more administrative or program-related activities. Following that, I'm going to talk about some of the complexities of tree ordinances. A lot of communities work with a broad range of issues, so we'll discuss how to identify the issues and how ordinances become increasingly complex. I'll also discuss some of the challenges that a lot of communities face in adopting tree ordinances and implementing them. And then the next layer will be the whole relationship with tree boards and where their authorities come from and their relationship with tree ordinances, really with the bottom line towards, what's the role of tree boards in this whole overarching issue. The last page on the presentation will present a series of resources that are in hypertext links, as Leslie suggested. It sounds like she's pulled them out and also posted them into this webinar, so they're there for you to access anytime. And then hopefully we'll have some time for discussion and questions and answers. Next, please. So the very first question I want to address is the question of Dillon rule or home rule. As long as I've been in North Carolina, there seems to be some lack of clarity as to the type of state we are. And just for some background information, home rule exists in a state where the state legislature delegates local authority over matters of local concern. So with the home rule state, the local units of government have broad legislative authority to address matters that concern them locally. Whereas a Dillon rule state, the local authorities are narrowly construed in the absence of legislative directives. So in Dillon rule states, local units of government really can't do anything unless the state legislature says that they can. So there's really a big difference. It's really basically home rule versus state rule over what local governments can do. The confusion in North Carolina is that North Carolina is neither. We do have a system of very specific enabling legislation that does give local governments very broad authorities, but that is combined with very inconsistent standards of judicial interpretation. So it's really not clear what the judicial branch of government says that authority says we can do and can't do, and it contributes to a lack of clarity in local government and administration. So I think that's why the question arises all the time. A lot of the local governments that I meet with and local tree boards tell me that they're not sure they can adopt ordinances or can adopt ordinances, and there's a lot of confusion with that. There's a link to the title on this particular slide that brings you to a very good article, which I hope Leslie has posted in the attachments, that was published by the University of North Carolina, that describes this confusion very well and also presents recommendations to the state legislature for clarification. Next, please. I'm giving you this background on Dillon versus Home Rule because I think that the state statute does give cities broad authority in North Carolina, and we'll take a quick look at the hierarchy of where our local authorities come from. And they're nested right here on this slide. It starts with state statute. The state statute results in the development of a city charter, and that city charter gives the councilmen or council people in the city the authority to adopt local ordinances. Next. The state statute that establishes cities and towns is Chapter 160 of state legislation, titled Cities and Towns. And again, the title on the inside of the bullet list where it says Chapter 160A, Cities and Towns, is a hypertext link that will bring you to that state law. And this law does seem to give folks in the state of North Carolina and cities some pretty broad authority. It first starts by defining what local government is and describes powers to city council. It describes and it establishes corporate limits, so it defines how a city defines their own limits, and pretty detailed information on standards for annexation. It goes into considerable detail on different forms of government that might exist. Some smaller towns, for example, may not have a city manager in an administrative form of government like some of the larger cities do. This chapter also gets into some considerable detail on general ordinance making power, which in my opinion seems to be pretty broad in the state. But one thing it does is it does focus on restrictions. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but after reading through the general ordinance making powers section, it seemed that the industries or interests that have strong lobbying skills are effective in getting restrictions built into the law as to what local communities can do. For example, there are some pretty broad restrictions for local communities on passing legislation against the billboard industry. There's some restrictions in there against regulating the forestry industry, and I'll get to that a little bit further on. There's restrictions in there against regulating the solar industry, which I think is a good thing. But anyway, this ordinance making power does give local units of government broad authority, but then it starts outlining things that local units of government can't do. Another important section, and we'll get into this next section in some pretty good detail, is the planning and regulation of development, which I think becomes important when you're dealing with tree protection ordinances and things like that. There are many more sections in this chapter guiding how cities levy taxes and do tax assessments, issues related to eminent domain, law enforcement, public utilities, parks and recreation, things like that. But the authority is broad in this chapter when it comes to ordinances, and I want to reemphasize that. I'll just quote the very first section, which reads, "A city may by ordinance define, prohibit, regulate, or abate emissions or conditions detrimental to the health, safety, or welfare of its citizens and the peace and dignity of the city, and may define and abate nuisances. And then it goes on to say what cities can't do, and primarily what cities can't do are things that are restricted by this code, or the cities can't do anything that infringes on liberties guaranteed by state and federal constitutions. Next. I want to spend a few minutes talking about Article 19 in this chapter, which is the article pertaining to planning and development. And part one of that article is the establishment of planning boards. And I think it's this article that gives the cities the authority to establish tree boards. And it reads, any city may by ordinance create or designate one or more boards or commissions to perform the following duties. And the duties are pretty broad. Make studies, determine objectives, prepare plans, develop recommendations and policies, provide advice to the council, exercise any functions in the administrative realm, and perform other duties as related. So it's my guess that this is where the authority for tree boards come from. One thing you'll see in this particular authority is that these boards don't have any authority for enforcement or for adjudication of any kind. One question I get often, and here in Asheville, the Tree Commission asks pretty often if they can have the authority to review and approve or make decisions on the removal of trees within the city, like the City of Atlanta does. The City of Atlanta's Tree Commission actually has adjudicative responsibilities, and they hear appeals and make decisions. But in the state of North Carolina, it does not seem that boards have the authority to do this. I do want to say that if you do have questions regarding, any authority for your tree board or the legality of your ordinances or anything like that, I encourage you to consult your city attorneys. And it's best to do that through some municipal staff because the city attorneys really work for the city. They don't work for citizen volunteers. So, and my experience is that the answers you'll get tend to be very conservative. And I think that that's probably because it's an avoidance behavior that attorneys typically try to make when it comes to, changes within the community. Next, please. The second, part two, there's several parts within the planning and development section or article. Part two relates to subdivision regulations. And with subdivision regulations, cities do have broad authorities with respect to orderly growth and development, coordination of utilities, planned streets, and conditions that substantially promote public health, safety, and general welfare. And I think it's important at this point that the more you describe the work that your trees do in your community as though they were public utilities or infrastructure, the more tree ordinances would align with this broad authority. Clearly, we can make an argument that trees do contribute substantially to public health and general welfare. So, I think regulating trees and development is legitimate based on what I'm reading here. There is a traditional forestry restriction within this section that says it's actually under Part 8 of this section called miscellaneous powers, what it basically says is that cities don't have the authority to regulate traditional forestry and forest harvesting practices. And it goes on to say so long as there's a legitimate forest management plan in place, which I think is a very good differentiation. It does go on to say that cities may exercise planning or zoning authority under that article. So again, I feel like we're steered back to a pretty broad authority that allows cities in the state of North Carolina to have ordinances that do affect private property and tree protection on those properties where public health and general welfare is at stake. Next, please. I did want to point out one other authority. I'm not going to get into any detail on this, but I did link it, so it's hopefully posted as an attachment, or you can access it through the presentation. And that's the authorities that are given to homeowners association. There are several thousand homeowners associations in the state of North Carolina that really don't fall under the purview of municipal government, and the North Carolina Planned Community Act gets into some pretty substantial detail on the authorities that HOAs have. So it might be, if you live in an HOA or you're working as a volunteer within an HOA, it might be worth giving it a glance. Next. So we moved from the state legislative authority to city charters and ordinances, and without getting into too much detail, as you look at your city charter, it does two basic things. It starts with the corporate organization, including establishment of the city council, and then it gives the city council the authority to establish ordinances and outlines procedures for establishing those procedures. So within the city's book of ordinances, a chapter on trees would exist, and within that chapter on trees would be the establishment of tree boards and tree commissions. So that's sort of how the nesting occurs. The city charters also get into a lot of the other detail that the state legislation has, such as law enforcement and the authority for zoning and planning and things like that. A very good publication that you might reference is one titled How North Carolina Cities Work, and this is a website that belonging to the North Carolina League of Municipalities. This is a great site if you're in a community working on a tree ordinance and you want to compare your issues with cities that are comparable geographically or in size. This website literally has every set of code for every city in the state of North Carolina. You just put the name of the city in the search engine, and it brings up the municipal code. And it's just a very nice website to work with if you're looking for examples. Next, please. So now that we know where our authorities come from, I want to spend some time looking at the components of an urban forestry program, which is the next layer that you would take a look at if you're looking at building your program or improving or adopting a tree ordinance. And urban forestry programs are really comprised of three primary elements. It's either programs, practices, or policies. So an urban forestry program within a municipality is not just ordinance-based, it's not just regulation. So a program is a full range of activities conducted to accomplish goals and objectives to meet a comprehensive need within a community. It could be regulatory, partially. Programs are typically a combination of both, or it could be completely non-regulatory. For example, a city may have a policy, which is the will of the people expressed through their government to accomplish a specific goal, but they may have a policy of no net loss canopy. That policy could be expressed in terms of written policy in the tree ordinance, or it could be that and then also a community-wide tree planting program using volunteers and nonprofit organizations that might be sponsored through the Office of Sustainability or something. So there's a lot of ways to approach policies and programs. A practice is a specific activity conducted within a discipline. So for the urban forest manager of your community, they will manage the trees using industry best management practices or standards of care. So you have both programs, practices, and policies, and all three of those combined make a comprehensive urban forest program. Next. So here's a listing of elements that would complete a community forestry program. If you had the perfect program, it would have all of these things: policies and ordinances, staff capacity and training, funding and accounting systems, a clear line of authority, who makes decisions, and how do those decisions cross jurisdictional boundaries within a city, you know, between public works and planning and parks and recreation, so on. Inventories of the resources on public land, public rights-of-way and parks, and urban tree canopy to pick up what exists on private lands. Management planning, which would also include risk management planning and disaster planning, the application of standards and best management practices, and then some element of community engagement. So as you look through this list, you can see that some of these activities or these elements may fall within a practice, some may fall within a program, and some of them may fall within a policy, and some may fall in multiple places. So there's just a lot of areas where you can engage in urban forestry without necessarily having regulation, but by still improving your program. Next, please. I want to say a little bit more about community tree policies. They're a deliberate position or plan of action to guide decisions and achieve outcomes. And policy could apply to government, as in this case we're discussing, but local nonprofit organizations, private sector organizations also establish policies that could help accomplish your goals, such as nonprofit tree groups, things like that. Policies differ from rules or laws which compel or prohibit behavior. However, laws are derived from policy. So, in other words, the city could again have a no net loss policy, which is, you know, their official policy for operation and may not be a law, but they can also adopt laws that can compel and move the city towards that direction, such as a law that requires permitting for tree removal and tree replacement as part of that law, and the regulation of trees on construction sites. So rules or laws are often used interchangeably, and I've already given you that example with no net loss canopy policy. Effective policy should do several things. One is that you should identify and explain a specific problem or reason for creating it. So there could be a perception that there's an issue with tree loss in your community, but it's really best if you can document what that tree loss is through urban tree canopy analysis or something to sort of build some baseline or benchmarking to explain the problem and to establish goals. It's important to do your homework before you go into a tree ordinance process. And then a lot of thought needs to go into creating specific solutions to problems. And it's sort of challenging with tree ordinances when you're balancing landowner rights and their rights to highest and best use of land with the need to save trees and protect water quality in the community. So specific solutions are important. And then always monitoring results once the policy is implemented is critically important. And sometimes those results might be negative, and that means you have to go back to the drawing board and tweak your policy. Next, please. So looking at community tree policy, they range in complexity, and these types of ordinances exist across the state, starting with some very basic tree ordinances, which essentially just establish tree boards and perhaps address the maintenance of trees from right-of-way. Moving towards more standard ordinances, which accomplish what the basic ordinances do, but then require a little bit more. A license for tree companies to practice within the city, permits for removal, and requirements for citizens to address nuisance tree issues. And then the next level is tree protection ordinances, which generally include the basic ordinance, standard ordinance, but then they move more towards trees and land development, and they present some minimum standard for tree coverage post-development, provide standards for tree protection, planting standards, and also species list and enforcement. And then the most complex type of ordinance that exists in the state would be a comprehensive tree and landscape ordinance that pretty much does all of the above, including landscape, strip and buffer requirements, and parking lot requirements, and things like that. So there's this increasing array of complexity, but going back to one of my previous slides, I really encourage you to identify the problems before you start engaging in changing your ordinances. Next slide. Some of the challenges that you'll navigate with tree ordinances are presented here. One is that I've learned that ordinances that are very rigid and lack flexibility could really derail them pretty quickly. I like the concept of alternative compliance, which provides applicants for permits to present alternatives if they can't meet the minimum standards. So building that type of flexibility into an ordinance is very important. Trees are pretty complex biological organisms, and they can't run away from us. And land development and building construction is a complicated process, and when they both clash, if you don't have flexibility, it's just not going to work. A second trick that I learned is to have a separate set of administrative standards that guide the implementation of your ordinance. So you have one document that's the ordinance, which really lays down the law or establishes the law in the communities, but the administrative standards explain how that's implemented, and in terms of tree protection, replacement, things like that. So with administrative standards, the administrative body, the Public Works Department or Parks Department or whoever is implementing the ordinance, has the ability to make administrative decisions without bringing the ordinance back in front of the city council or an appeals body on a regular basis. So building flexibility into an ordinance is very important. Another challenge that I've seen with ordinances is that there are at times unrealistic expectations. If communities expect their tree ordinances to function as a growth management tool, it's just not going to work. And many times I've seen people in neighborhoods trying to use the tree ordinances to stop development because they don't want a particular type of development in their backyard. It's that not in my backyard phenomenon that tends to happen. So again, clearly defining what your ordinance is intended to accomplish and not having unrealistic expectations will help you address that challenge. Another obstacle that communities run into is that with lack of staffing. Often tree ordinances can amp up the responsibility of planning and review staff and enforcement staff and the forest management staff in a community. So that complication should be thought of as you're going through the ordinance adoption process. Lack of coordination is another challenge, and I call this the paper, scissors, stone syndrome, and that's coordination between various departments within a city. You might be trying very hard to save some trees, and you might have a stormwater engineer knocking all your trees down because their drainage system is more important and the trees are in the way, or traffic engineers prohibiting trees where you're trying to get trees planted because of site distance and things like that. So it's important to have full coordination between the various departments so that we all know what their issues are and we can accommodate everybody. There are some practical difficulties with tree ordinances, and I find this particularly in cases related to infill development, especially in older neighborhoods where you've had trees, where trees have had the opportunity to mature, and you have very large trees on small lots, and small bungalows are knocked down and larger houses are put in place. And it's almost a practical impossibility to save trees. So in situations like that, without heroic efforts. So knowing that going into the process is important. And one thing that helps is flexibility with some of the planning requirements so that you can adjust setback lines, for example, to move the larger houses back if you can do that, or adjust height requirements so you can go more vertical and do a smaller footprint. And then a pretty high degree of professionalism so that you have with your arborist or urban forester or consultants that are working with the builders so that they can deal with some complicated issues related to infill development, such as boring with underground utilities and mitigating practices or prescriptive practices to protect the trees. And then the last challenge I see pretty often is lack of resolve in the community. And sometimes I've seen communities sort of fold under strong pushback by the development community just because the pressure gets pretty strong on them. And to fight this challenge, I think a very strong stakeholder engagement is important so that the community is fully engaged in what the city is trying to accomplish with tree ordinances. Next. This moves us to the third layer, and which is the role of tree boards with tree ordinances and community forestry programs. And based on the earlier part of the presentation, it's clear that tree boards have more than anything else an advisory role. They can also function as an advisory role, providing research and recommendations, exploring solutions. They can go so far as drafting documents and providing review and helping communicate tree ordinances to the community. They do play an advocacy role, stakeholder engagement, community outreach, and working with the media and providing education, I think, is very important. We've seen some tree boards across the state involved directly with tree planting programs and some tree maintenance programs, citizen forester programs where they're training communities and going out and pruning young trees and things like that. Accountability, I think, is very important, functioning as sort of a community tree watch and reporting issues back to the community. The one thing I want to emphasize is that there's some things that tree boards don't do in North Carolina, and that's enforcement and decision-making and adjudication. They're not policy boards, but they are advisory and advocacy boards. So that's one thing that's different in this state than we might see in some other states. So we'll take a quick tour of North Carolina and look at what some of the tree boards are doing across the state. And this is taken directly from tree board websites, and it's paraphrased, so I don't have the the full language just so I can fit it on the slide. But in the city of Charlotte, tree board, it plays an advocacy role, an education role, an advisory role to city council. Wilmington, their mission is to promote and endorse programs and policies to support, maintain, and grow the urban forest, increase education, and establish award and recognition programs. So again, it's more an advisory role. In the city of Asheville, where I live, our mission is a little bit more foggy to me, and maybe that's something we might look at changing over the next year, and that's to facilitate the planting, growing, and protection of trees within the city and conduct continuing research, planning, and feasible assessments, whatever that might be. We'll go to some smaller towns. Weaverville, which is just outside of Asheville. Their mission is to study, investigate, counsel, and develop ideas and plans for the care, investigate, make findings, and report upon and recommend to City Council and serve as an advisory board. Albemarle, out on the coast, it's the one tree board I found that has the word regulation in their authority. But that regulation has to do with public trees on public rights-of-way within the city, and not public trees. But the tree board in Albemarle takes the responsibility for preservation, care, planting, and regulation of street trees and other trees in public spaces. And then finally, Wilkesboro, their mission is to study and develop and/or update annually specifications for care, conserving, pruning, planting, replanting of public-owned trees and shrubs and parks. So most tree boards study, advise, develop standards, recommendations, and are commonly just focused on public trees in public areas and along streets. This is just a snapshot, but if you go back to that website that I mentioned, League of Municipalities, you can literally look at every city in the state of North Carolina and get a feeling for what they're doing with their tree boards and also their tree ordinances. So here are the resources that I listed: the document on Dillon Rule, the two state statutes on cities and towns, and the Planned Community Act, or HOAs, the North Carolina League of Municipalities. One website that's chock full of information is Urban Forestry South, which is a Forest Service partner site. and then the handbook for tree board members, which is an old but beloved and still timely handbook developed by the National Arbor Day Foundation. So next. So with that, I've been talking for about 40 minutes, so I'd like to give you all a chance to ask questions, and I guess we'll open that up. Leslie?
Okay, great. Thank you, Ed. Just a quick note of, well, giving you guys a couple minutes to enter a question or two. I do have some that got entered, but that tree board handbook I did add as a document that you guys can download. It is the older version. Arbor Day Foundation has updated that tree board handbook. It's got some new content, so if you want some updated standards or examples or not policies, but kind of protocols that they kind of suggest in there, you can purchase that through the Arbor Day Foundation website. I just wanted to bring that up to everybody's attention.
Right. Yeah, they're sort of rejuvenating their Tree City USA program, and I knew that they were working on an update to that publication. I just didn't know it was available yet, so it's good to hear that it's out there.
Yeah, it's out and about and being distributed. But so we do have a couple of questions on there. I'd say for those of you that joined us a little bit late, just go to the Q&A dialog box in the top left, and you can enter in a question that you might have had for Ed along the way, and I'll read it out to him, and he'll answer it as best he can. So one of the questions that we had is it possible that North Carolina tree boards do in fact have adjudiatory powers, since the Charlotte Tree Advisory Commission has quasi-judicial responsibilities laid out in its ordinance?
And which tree commission is that?
The Charlotte Tree Advisory Commission.
Right. I think that's a good question. I don't have the answer for you. I do think that some of the cities do have some grandfathered policy and powers that existed prior to some amendments to the state statute. So it's entirely possible that some of those authorities may exist. That's why it's really important to talk to your city attorney, because there does seem to be a little confusion as to what tree boards can do and not do. I do know that the state legislature also grants what they call exemptions to the state law for communities to do things that they may not have the authority for. And that typically requires the full local delegation putting a request into the state legislature for those exemptions.
Okay. All right. I have another question. You had a slide that talked about the different types of tree ordinances: basic, standard, protection, comprehensive tree and landscape ordinance. What happens if the community skips a step or goes right for a tree protection ordinance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I threw the slide out to show the increasing complexity of ordinances, but if the city has the capacity or the need to draft an ordinance as their first ordinance, being one of the more comprehensive forms, there's really nothing wrong with that, as long as they watch out for some of the challenges that I also mentioned. So this slide isn't intended to show a progression in how a city's tree program might mature, but it's intended to show the array of increasing complexity that a tree ordinance might have.
Okay. I have another question. It says, we view as a major tree protection problem is the utilities trimming trees. Understood that they have the authority to protect their power lines and et cetera, but is there anything that can be advised to the city for creating some city authority to regulate how much trimming can be done?
Right. I would have to go back to the Chapter 160 of the state legislation to see if communities are prohibited from regulating public utilities. I seem to recall that there was something in there that does make that prohibition. However, having said that, there's nothing that will stop the city from engaging with the public utility to discuss standards of care and enter into agreements that would be a little more tree friendly. So, my answer to the question is probably the easiest solution is to sit down with your public utility and talk to them about what they're doing and see if there's ways that you know, they can reduce their pruning cycle so the pruning, for example, isn't as radical, and to give the community a little advance notice as to when they're going to be doing utility line clearance, things like that. Usually some compromise is in order in a case like that, so it's good to have something in your pocket to offer the public utilities, such as, you know, when the tree's ready to go, we'll remove it and replace it with a tree that's more, you know, space friendly with that utility line. So local negotiation is very important in this case.
Yes, and I would say, just to have a comment on it, is that they're required by the federal guidelines to do the utility line clearance standards, and that it's the federal guidance that sets the distances that they're supposed to have clear. So they're kind of required to do that. But I do know that working with Duke Energy in North Carolina and a couple of the local cooperatives, that they have arborists on staff that are willing to work with each community to, again, like Ed said, come up with a compromise, work within your ordinance and what your requirements are, and see what kind of flexibility there might be on both sides to get a working effort going. So I'd say if you're having issues with your utility line clearance practices, to contact that utility, and they should have a representative, most likely an arborist, that is willing to work with you.
Right. And you know, one other follow-up, the fact that you mentioned that utilities are subject to federal guidelines does make it a prohibition for communities to regulate them. Because in the powers to adopt ordinances, it specifically says that local ordinance can't supersede federal requirements. So. Okay.
All right. I don't have any other questions that came in. If anybody wants to take a second or two to add another one, while I'm waiting for that, I'll go ahead and go to the slide that has the ISA credit code. So what's on there now is you copy down that code and then you submit it yourself to ISA, and then they will put that 1 hour credit towards your requirements there. And then the other question I've got that came through while I was talking is about getting a complete set of the slides. And yes, I will, Ed had forwarded me his presentation. I will put a PDF, I'll send out a PDF version of it to everybody, or if not everybody wants it, I can do it straight to you, George, and get that covered there. But if nobody else has any other questions, we can kind of finish up a little early, I guess. I just want to draw your attention to a couple other webinars that we already have on the schedule for 2017. We have one coming up in June and another one in August on other topics related to, I think are pretty important to tree boards. So just make note of those on your calendar, and if you haven't registered for them, go ahead and register on our website. You can find that all there. Let's see. I think that is it. That's all I've got, unless Ed, you had anything else you wanted to add for anybody. But okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us today. I really appreciate you guys taking time out of your day for this. I hope you were able to glean some information from it, and I'll get that PDF version of his presentation out to the folks that wanted it, as well as if there are any issues with the links, I can get those out to people as well. And Ed, thank you so much for working with us with all the technical difficulties. Hopefully it wasn't too tedious for you, and I appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.